For our next panel, please welcome to the stage members of the European Parliament, Eva Maydell and Dragoș, as well as the Honorable Michael Bennet, U.S. Senator from Colorado and a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Honorable Brendan Boyle, U.S. Representative from Pennsylvania and co-chair of the Congressional European Union Caucus. We are pleased to have Jamil Anderlini, Editor-in-Chief of Politico Europe, moderate this conversation about transatlantic cooperation from strategic competition. Jamil, over to you.
I'm here in Brussels. I've joined many panels before where honored guests were virtual. I've literally never seen one where a moderator is virtual. So I'm honored and very, very happy to be here. I wish I could be there in person. I take this as a sign of great American innovation and very excited to be here. This is a fantastic panel. Eva is a great friend of mine here in Brussels. Dragoș is soon to be a new friend. Michael Bennet is my senator. I vote in Colorado, so he happens to be my senator. And Brendan and I have enjoyed some fun times here in Brussels as well. So it's fantastic. They're gonna, I'm sure, treat me gently, and I will not do the same to them. But first of all, I wanted to ask all of you, first, before we start into individual questions, what is the state of the Transatlantic Alliance relationship, scale of 1 to 10, and where are the points of friction or problems, tension, perhaps, in the relationship? So perhaps we start with Eva. Can we go to you with 1 to 10, scale of 1 to 10, where are we with the state of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I would like to think that in political terms, I think the state of transatlantic relationships are at a very good place. If you want concrete numbers, that could be an 8 or a 9 or even a 10. Depends, which particular part you are assessing. But if you look at the way Ursula von der Leyen and President Biden are in constant communication over topics such as Ukraine, in fact, the most important topic, I think this is an excellent sign. However, if you go and look into details of where it would be very beneficial for the EU and the US to be strengthening our cooperation, to be learning from one another, to be exchanging more on topics related to competitiveness, growth, green energy, clean tech, artificial intelligence, technology, and emerging tech, I think there is ample opportunities for us to further strengthen those relationships and strike new projects, new pacts, make sure that we bring other democratic nations on board that would share our vision on these topics.
Senator, can I go to you? 1 to 10, and your summary of the state of the transatlantic relationship.
So I would say I would agree that it is a 9 or a 10 if we had to assign a number to it, particularly compared to what it was like, just a few years ago. I'm not sure that anybody understood how tested the Transatlantic Alliance. In fact, I'm sure that we didn't know how tested it would be. I think we didn't know how tested NATO would be. And I think it was just 2 years ago very unclear what the world's reaction to an invasion of Ukraine by Putin what that would yield. And it's extraordinary what it has yielded. I mean, Avril Haines was up here just a few minutes ago. If we're honest about it, I don't think our intelligence community would have predicted that Ukraine would have done as well as it's done. I don't think that people would have understood that the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people and of President Zelensky, who met with us today, he was graceful enough to meet with the Senate today, that they would inspire the entire democratic world, in a fight that is not only for Ukraine, but is a fight for democracy. And I think that has created an opportunity for us to strengthen the alliances that we have had. And I agree also with my colleague that there are areas where we're out of sync with each other. And this is an opportunity for us, I think, to sync up and to ask the question, not just about how do you push back on the hideously unconscionable invasion by Putin of Ukraine, but as humanity and living in democracies, how do we offer something better to humanity than Xi Jinping is offering? And I think that is where we're going to find ample opportunity to work together in a way, probably in collaboration, that we have not seen since the Cold War.
I should mention to the audience that Senator Bennet has a hard stop. There is a vote, and we believe very strongly, I'm sure all of us, in supporting and strengthening democracy. We want him to go and practice some democracy. So a hard stop at
I thought
2
you were going
p.m.
to say, since I have a hard stop, I should cut my answers in half.
No. But a hard stop at 2 p.m. And I believe Congressman Boyle also may have to a little more unpredictable on when the votes are. I believe in the House, but
that's putting it mildly.
He might also have to slip off the stage at some point. So we will excuse them because, as I said, we all believe so strongly in the functioning of a strong democracy. To give that example to the rest of the world, Congressman Boyle, perhaps I'll move to you. 1 to 10, and your assessment of the current state of the relationship.
As an homage to the late great John McLaughlin, I will give it an 8.72. If you ever remember his show, he was very particular on his the scale he used. So there seems to be quite a consensus here that it is, if not at perfection level, that it is very high. If you consider just the post-World War II period, I think the low probably was 20 years ago. At this time was the run-up where the invasion had already taken place in Iraq. That I think was the low point in terms of transatlantic relations. We were in a better place a few years ago than we were 20 years ago, but still not in a great place. I mean, take NATO, for example. It was just a few years ago that you had the French president calling NATO brain dead. I serve in a body called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I remember at the 2019 NATO meeting in London, that November, December, we were celebrating a big 70th anniversary of NATO. And the open joke, in terms of gallows humor, was whether or not we would be celebrating a 75th anniversary of NATO. No one jokes like that at all. So this is truly, I think, the highest point in the transatlantic relationship, certainly since November 1989, that day when, shockingly, the Berlin Wall came down. Now, why isn't it quite a 10? There are still some challenges. Our trade relationship is not as strong as I would like it to be. Combined, the U.S. and the European Union account for 42% of the world's GDP. But we're a long ways away from where we thought we were maybe in 2015 when TTIP, if you recall, that was being negotiated. And there are some issues that might come up even in the course of this conversation regarding how we treat digital privacy, taxation, those sorts of things that still lend themselves to some conflict, although it's very, very manageable. And again, this is absolutely one of the highest points in the post-World War II era.
Now, Dragoș, I'm relying on you to break a bit of consensus, be a bit of a contrarian. Come on, give me something slightly different from the down the middle. 1 to 10, and your assessment, please.
Well, I'll actually go with a 9 myself. To invest,
Terrible.
to invest, to continue to invest in the relationship and make it a 10. Not go for lower than that, but why the 9? Because I do think that over the last 4 years, there's been a clear political investment in the relationship. I think we've worked hard on trade and technology in the TTC since we are in a summit on AI. We have worked incredibly well on Ukraine, I think more than anybody would have expected. And we are gradually, but I think irreversibly, also aligning on China. And there are many, many other points where we see eye to eye with each other. Clearly, there are things, that's why we cannot give it a 10, and I think we all agree. We've had IRA and the irritants that were produced by that. Now, on the European side, we're going to have STEP. So we will see exactly what kind of a reaction that will cause. And I think we also need to very seriously start thinking at some anchors that would continue to make sure that this relationship stays at the 9, because we are going to have political elections in Europe next year. There will be elections in the US next year. And if I look at the polls on the EU side, we will have a surge of political forces on the extreme right. Will that bring a different tone on including on the relationship with the US? I certainly hope not. But certainly there will be turbulences ahead. And I think that if we also start investing beyond the very strong political engagement and rhetoric, we need to start thinking at some very concrete anchors that we can put on technology, on trade, on foreign policy, speaking of critical materials and critical supply chains, so on and so forth, to make sure that, again, through the turbulences, possible turbulences or changes of next year, we will stay at a 10 or at a 9.
So all of you have been staunch advocates for support for Ukraine in this brutal Russian invasion, Russian war on the Ukrainian people. I literally this morning in Brussels hosted our daily news meeting, and in it we were discussing how potentially Ukraine might have lost support even from Eastern Europe, which has been probably the staunchest supporting nations in terms of this war when it comes to Ukraine. So even there, we're starting to hear some rumblings, some talk about the costs. So maybe for you, Senator Bennet, because I know you have to leave in 2 minutes, very quickly before you leave, where do you see it going? Do you think that America in particular will stay the course? Do you think we can keep supporting Ukraine even with a lack of, high success in its latest counteroffensive?
Well, yes is my answer. Yes is my answer, because this isn't just a fight for Ukraine. As I said, this is a fight for democracy. And I know everybody becomes a Monday morning quarterback about this counteroffensive. Just like, when the Federal Reserve here is raising rates or lowering rates, everyone in Congress all of a sudden is an expert economist. The reality is if people would just step back for a second and consider the extraordinary success that the Ukrainian military has had with our support, with Europe's support, the extraordinary way in which the Ukrainian people have risen to this occasion. And if you just wound the movie back to the beginning of this invasion and said 2 years later, what would be the situation? This would have eclipsed anybody's sense of what we've done. And I think it's very important for us at this moment, when there is no doubt among the leadership in Ukraine about what they've done for democracy, and when people there are sacrificing their lives, and among other things, an ancillary effect of what's happened is we have become stronger together. Putin has been revealed for what he is. Xi has to think now 3 or 4 times again about what he's going to do with respect to Taiwan. I think we should look at that and say, that is a success. We need to support it. And I would say the United States in particular has a irreplaceable responsibility here. And I think we're going to see a big bipartisan vote out of the U.S. Congress supporting the supplemental for Ukraine. That's what I think.
Well, thank you very much. And I know you have to leave in just a minute. So it's great to see you. And,
thank you for having me. Thank you.
Forward to seeing you in person.
I know you didn't actually say whether you voted for me or not. We're
say
happy to
that.
have you in Summit County.
We're completely nonpartisan at Politico, so I couldn't possibly endorse a candidate like that, especially because I'm so huge on the stage, it looks like, from what I can see. The senator mentioned Xi Jinping's view and the relevance of what's happening in Ukraine for the very brave nation of Taiwan. I'm very interested to hear from other panelists, and it was mentioned a little bit before. I'm very interested to hear from other panelists how you see China in Europe and in the United States. And I think, Dragoș, you mentioned that there is a bit of distance between the US and Europe on China. How does Ukraine play out? How does it play into considerations around Taiwan? And why do you think there's such a gap? And how do we close that gap between the US and Europe? Maybe Eva, could I call on you first on that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So first of all, I think it was briefly touched upon. I mean, Europe's position on Ukraine, because I think we need to see where we are today in order to look for possible changes in our foreign policy, our geopolitical strategy, and so on and so forth. So Europe's position is very clear right now. We will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Would I want us to have taken swifter measures, even more ambitious measures and bolder measures up until today when it comes to our support to Ukraine? Yes, of course. But in the same time, we have shown the unity, which you in your previous question tried to touch upon. Everyone before crisis always says, well, will Europe stick together? Well, we not only stuck together, we are still sticking together to our decisions. Again, could have been bolder. It could have been more efficient and effective, for example, on sanctions. But we also strengthened the transatlantic relationships through that. So this is where we are. But in order for us to be able to see the bigger picture, I think we need to make sure first that Ukraine wins that war and that it's not prolonged as long as it's already is enough prolonged. The second point is that while supporting and helping Ukraine, we don't lose the sight of the ever more complex global issues that are out there. We need to be able to see beyond our borders. We need to make sure to prepare to be much better prepared and resilient for future shocks, whether they come from China or elsewhere. But particularly on China, the third thing we need to make sure is that I like to call it a renewed Europe policy on China. And that will take a long time, and it will make a lot of sense if we at least focus in the area of critical and emerging technology. I think it will be important for us to have that discussion. So kind of when the president of the commission talks about de-risking, to kind of unpuzzle that term and understand what it exactly means in concreteness. So I'm someone that very much would like to see this happening. But in order for us as Europeans to do all these steps, we indeed need to have that unity. And we can only have that unity if societies understand the importance of winning that war and the importance of Europe having a glance at possible issues that are out there and trying to prepare for possible difficult situations. In order for us to do that, we need to talk to our societies daily. We need to be a much more effective communicators in order for the topic not to fall out of sight from societies, and also in order for us to be able to counter the enormous amount of propaganda that is out there in some of our European countries at the moment. So I think those things are achievable if you have strong political leadership, but that strong political leadership in Europe has to engage with our societies so that they continue their support in Ukraine. It is very high in some countries, in others a bit lower. But I think, also as the senator said earlier, it's a very clear battle. It is a battle between democracies and autocracies. That's at least the way I see it. I'm a little bit more blunt on the black and white issue here. And I would very much want to see us, make sure that that war is won in a timely manner by Ukraine, of course.
Thank you very much. Dragoș, to bring us back more to the topic at hand of AI and technology, you were a co-reporter of the EU's AI Act, which is, I believe, the world's first comprehensive legislation on AI. So what are the factors that you think are the most important when you are trying to strike that balance, not always an easy balance, between regulation and innovation?
Well, this has been from the very start, and Eva has been part of that process as well. This has been from the very start one of the challenges, but also one of the things that kept us focused in the negotiations in Parliament and now in the negotiations with the Council in finding that balance. It was evident to me from the very start, in the first draft report that I wrote, that, of course, protecting our interests and protecting the interests of society and of humans is the essential thing that this legislation is to deliver. But at the same time, we have to be constantly mindful of not taking off the table the opportunities and the stimulants for innovation that are absolutely key to actually allow us Europeans to also reap the benefits of AI. So again, that balance was a fundamental element in the conversation. And now I spent the past couple of days here in Washington discussing with fellow legislators on what the process in Congress and in Senate is now around AI. Certainly much more intense than it was only 5-6 months ago when I would come here and I would talk about AI. There is a sense of urgency and purpose that actually gives me great hope that we will also be reaching that moment when we can be aligned on the approach on AI. And here, I think we all heard Senator Schumer mention exactly that, the balance between safeguards and innovation. That's precisely what Senator Schumer said. That is precisely what anyone working on the AI Act on the European side would say as well. We've introduced provisions in the text that are meant to help companies ensure compliance. We have sandboxes as a structural element to stimulate innovation and to allow lower costs for compliance for companies that would be still engaging in developing high-risk applications. We have a mandate for standards that are supposed to be bottom-up, again, to ensure that innovation is instigated and that also companies are part of the process. So all of these elements, together with the broader measures that are meant to help ecosystems, when we heard President von der Leyen last week speak of the 3G and mention that 3 of the most powerful supercomputers in the world are now in the Union and they will be put at the disposal of AI developers to train and prepare models out there. So again, it's not only through the AI Act that we will be delivering our objectives on artificial intelligence. It's a much broader landscape and ecosystem that we have to invest in order to deliver us that balance between protection and innovation that we want to achieve. But I'm pretty confident that we have now the good framework to achieve that.
Thank you. Representative Boyle, you're the co-chair of the EU caucus in the House. And one area of contention, frankly, it affects our business like it does many businesses, is the lack of a similar data protection in the United States to the data protections in Europe, which some people argue are maybe a little bit of overkill. When a same company can't access data in one part of the world that it can access freely in the other part of the world, it can cause friction and difficulties. But how do you see, Representative Boyle, do you see the US moving closer to what Europe has with very, very strong data protection legislation? Or do you see Europe potentially moving more, reversing some of that, the strict rules that we have here in Europe?
Yeah, well, so first on the data privacy framework, I mean, the administration put some pretty top-notch and serious people on as part of that grouping to attempt to reach this framework, which after a lot of time and effort, they were able to come to somewhat of an agreement. You need to recognize the challenge. There is, and you were alluding to this, very different type of system in Europe and within the EU as exists in the US. I also think further complicating matters is, frankly, Congress has not passed our own data privacy law here for American citizens. Last term in Congress, out of committee, there was a sweeping bipartisan bill that passed 53-2. And I did not have the opportunity to vote on that because it never came up in the full House, and I don't believe anything is passed in the Senate. So we still, in Congress, have a ways to go in terms of getting our own act in order. Even then, before we can have the conversation about better integration, or at least having the two systems communicate with one another. I will say, though, if you're inviting me to provide a prediction on what this will look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, it's hard for me to envision a regulatory regime in the US that looks anything as strict as currently exists in the EU when it comes to data privacy. Whether one is in favor of it or not, I would have a hard time seeing that come to pass in the US.
Interesting. Eva, back to you. Perhaps for the last word, depends how long you would like to answer. We're coming nearly to the end of our panel. But next year, obviously, is a massive election year. We in Politico have been talking about it as, my American colleagues have been talking about it as the Super Bowl of elections and the Super Bowl for Politico. We in Europe like to think of it more as a much rarer and more consequential as maybe the World Cup in soccer rather than the Super Bowl, which happens, as I remind you, every 5 years rather than every year. But joking aside, it is a huge election year. What do you think both sides, the US and Europe, should be prioritizing when it comes to techno-industrial cooperation, Taiwan, Ukraine, the rise of China, the challenge of China? What would you say has to be the main focus, no matter who's elected on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah. So particularly when it comes to tech and emerging tech, I think it will make a lot of sense that the relationship that we have already built through the different working groups in the TTC or at the G7 Hiroshima process, that we kind of bring them to perhaps a more coordinated, a more collaborative level where we are able to convene more often. We could call it a group of tech-wise council, however we want to name it. But the idea would be that it's not just the ones writing the laws or the rules or the guardrails agreeing to voluntary measures, but that it would the group would remove the silo conversations that we are currently having. I've talked just in the past week to so many people. They've all been in a different conversation in Congress, in the White House, in the UK, with some of us in Brussels. And we are all kind of talking about the same thing, but we are not part of the same conversation. So it's not just for the ones that are writing, as I said, putting pen to paper on the guardrails, but it's also, of course, for the private sector to be part of that conversation, academia, civil society, experts, engineers, so on and so forth. It has to happen in a more coordinated manner. And the reason I think this is necessary is because if now the first instinct we have is we need to regulate and we need to do something about this, I think in the long run, we'll need to be looking at it in a very different way. It's going to be some type of a new type of more flexible, resilient, relevant way of addressing those emerging technologies.
I see there's only 50 seconds left on the clock, so I will absolutely be very quick. If I had to choose one very specific answer, there's no question that the 2024 general presidential election in the United States is the most significant, especially as it relates to the war funding in Ukraine. I was interested in how confident Michael was that Senator Bennet was that our supplemental would pass. He serves in a Senate chamber where the Republicans there are much more pro-Ukraine or supportive of the war effort than the chamber where I serve in the House. depending on how those elections go, if you have a MAGA majority and a return of President Trump, I have a very hard time believing that we would continue funding the war effort. I pray to God it doesn't happen, but that is a possibility we all need to be clear-eyed about.
And something we talk about a lot at Politico. And I want to thank this fantastic panel. Thank you for being so flexible and allowing me to join from across the Atlantic. It's a great honor, a great pleasure. I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.